All right, everybody, it's time for you to get out and nominate your favorite podcasts. There's a show I want you to consider for the People's Choice Podcast Awards. Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast in 3 categories: education, storyteller and drama, and arts. For 5 years and with over 280 weekly episodes and 64 million plus downloads, the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast has provided advice and tips from international best-selling authors, world-class artists, contest judges and winners, and industry professionals. It is based on the world-famous Writers of the Future contest created in 1983 by L. Ron Hubbard to help the aspiring writer and artist no matter their age, race, ethnicity, or gender. It is dedicated to the future of storytelling and art by showing that it is never too late to start, and those who make it are those who never give up. We are all busy, but I'd be so grateful if you could take a moment and vote now. Go to podcastawards.com to nominate the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast in any or all 3 of the categories: education, storyteller, drama, or art. News on the flip side. It's time for you to get out and nominate your favorite podcast. There's an amazing show I want you to consider for the People's Choice Podcast Awards. The News on the Flip Side, in the category of politics and news. News on the Flip Side is a much different news and political program, which is not deemed as opinion news. Listen as anchor host Joe Montaldo brings you just the facts from trusted sources, which will allow you, the people, to make up your own minds on the various stories being reported on. Go to podcastawards.com to nominate the News on the Flip Side in the category of news and politics. That's podcastawards.com. Please take a moment and vote now.
Hello, and welcome to the Writers of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, I thank you very much. I would also appreciate if you took a moment to follow it on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts. Writers of the Future is one of the longest running competitions in the world, now celebrating 4 decades of providing a helping hand as initially conceived by L. Ron Hubbard. I also want to let you know that Writers of the Future volumes are available in bookstores throughout the US, Canada, the UK, South Africa, and Australia, as well as through all major online retailers. We are here at the Writers and Illustrators of the Future workshop in Hollywood, where our contest judges have come from all aspects of the professional side of science fiction and fantasy creation to impart their hard-won knowledge of the industry to help pay forward to the next generation. Today's guest arrived a day early, and I scheduled him for this podcast as soon as I finished greeting him. Craig Elliott is in the animation industry. He has worked primarily for Disne and Dreamworks, designing animated films such as Hercules, Mulan, The Emperor's New Groove, Treasure Planet, Shark Tale, Flushed Away, B-Movie, Enchanted, Monsters vs. Aliens, and The Princess and the Frog, as well as many, many other upcoming features. I've seen you're also creative director for, weren't Netflix?
Production designer at Netflix for Leo, the movie about a little lizard with Adam Sandler as the voice. That was recent. Trying to think. There's a film from Toei coming out. Another one, it's a completely independent film, both Monkey King films based on the sort of Chinese tale. Trying to think. Oh, and then Sony, the Star movie about like Mary and Joseph and their donkey. That came out maybe 7 years ago, something like that. I think that was my first production designer role. I was also art director at Ken Duncan Studios, who's a former Disney animator, animated many of the like classic and like really well-known characters from sort of the 90s and like, yeah, I guess all 90s traditionally animated films. And then he started his own studio. And then I was briefly art director for Sideshow Collectibles. I don't know if you know what they do, but they make statues.
Yeah.
Like if you go to Comic-Con, they have that huge, they've got maybe like a 40 by 40 booth.
That's where I've seen them, yeah. Anyway, so welcome, Craig.
Thank you. I'm adding to my own little
yeah, it's
bio
like I knew
there.
mine was seriously out of date because it was only up to a month ago. So we had to get the next.
Right. No, I need to update that. That's my fault.
Yeah. So now you were a guest on this podcast, I guess about 3 years ago when I was a young pup, and it's grown quite a bit. So there's going to be a lot of people that don't know, at least through this podcast, who you are and what you've done and why we're so honored to have you as one of our judges. So how about just a quick review of like how you got started in art and how that evolved? And I'll be interrupting you periodically to ask questions and stuff.
That's fine. Gosh, got started in art. That goes back a long ways. There are artists in my family. I have, I don't know how her relation is, but Sunset Magazine is a magazine like that's been going since probably the early 30s or 20s, maybe in the West. It's sort of been kind of a California living magazine for, well, that's 100 years about.
Yeah.
And one of the earliest issues, this like great aunt of mine did the cover of, and Sunset to this day still sells posters and mugs and all sorts of stuff with her cover on it. It's just such a beautiful piece. And she lived in Santa Cruz somewhere, I believe, but I never met her. I think she died before, or maybe I was a really little kid and I never met her. So she was an illustrator. And then I had an aunt up in Santa Rosa that was also a painter, jewelry designer. Like, I think she lives almost exactly like I do in a little house on a big property with a river at the back, right? Like something in the DNA, I guess. And she did a lot of illustrations for local, like Santa Rosa things, and also which was also a California Impressionist fine art. That's kind of a category of Impressionists. There were a group of them in the early, I guess it was 1900s to like maybe 1930, something like that. So there's this thread kind of at least on my mom's side of the family of artists. And my grandfather had a great interest in art, did life drawing and drew, and was actually an engineer and draftsman for many well-known companies, a lot of utility companies. He designed trucks, and I even helped him do some of the graphic design when I was a teenager. But he would draw for me when I was a kid. I have this sketchbook that we drew in all throughout my childhood, and he would draw a little pig, and then I would try to draw something with the pig. And a lot of what he would do, I somehow I was really fascinated. He would draw like how orange juice was made, right? Like, and the whole process from like he would draw a little orchard and some guy on a ladder picking oranges, and then they get in the truck and they go to the factory, get squeezed, right? And they all come out in a little container. And he used to say my nose would be so close to the paper that he could barely draw. He'd have to push my face around to like keep drawing. So I think that having him, for some reason, that was just how one of the things we really interacted on. And he just, it's one of those things with kids, you just kind of follow their lead, right? Like, what do they like? What do they respond to? And obviously I responded to that. So he just kept doing it. And I didn't really think of myself as an artist because it was like the pool I was swimming in, right? Like, so I guess I was drawing ever since probably like 3 or whatever, right? Like when he would draw with me, right?
Yeah.
But it was never something that like I said, I never thought of myself as an artist. I didn't sort of practice it, right, as a thing or have a goal, right? Oh, I want to make paintings, or, like when you're older, there's a purpose to it, right? But as a kid, it's just sort of like another way of playing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was a junior in high school that I took a official art class. I went to a Catholic school that didn't really have art classes for junior high, all like elementary through junior high. And then for whatever reason, it wasn't till junior year in high school that I took an art class. And my art teacher like somehow contacted my mom and said, like, this guy is an artist, right? Like, it's like, I haven't seen somebody draw like this in decades or whatever. And so he was luckily he was like the head of the art department at my school, but also of the entire Santa Clara region. He had a regional occupational program that he ran in graphic design and illustration. So the very next year he put me in that, and I learned like how to design business cards, how to do illustration, like book covers, like all this stuff from him. And then I thought I wanted to be a graphic designer. So I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo for that. And then I took like my first life drawing class, and the teacher, it was kind of the same thing, like, get the hell out of here. Like, you need to be an illustrator. Go to this place called Art Center where I went.
Pasadena?
Yes. Yeah. Robert Densham, I think is the guy's name that was my drawing instructor. And I think I probably went down there and kind of like tried to figure out what it was they like, asked them what they wanted in a portfolio and what sorts of pieces and stuff. And I think they said more life drawing and sort of the fundamentals, right? Like,
right.
Give us some oranges, give us some like life drawing, like all the basics. So I took maybe like a semester and took some like drawing classes from a local art center in Palo Alto, and sort of beefed out my portfolio a little bit, and then went down there and I got in, and that was sort of my education, really, the arc of my education. I had
by the way, you said the Pasadena Art Center. Gary Meyer was one of our judges.
Yeah, Gary. He was a teacher of mine. He taught me perspective there.
He was amazing.
I sort of learned perspective from TV, PBS when I was a kid. I can't remember the name of the guy. He would wear like a light blue, what do you call them? It's like a smock. Yeah, a smock. Like it buttons down, almost like a trench coat.
Mr. Rogers?
Not Mr. Rogers, no. And he would draw like cubes in perspective and sort of like build off of that. Like, here, let's start with a cube, and then we can put like a prism, and then that's the roof of a house, and then we can put some cylinders. That's some trees, right? Like, it's funny. I've never gone back and tried to figure out what was this guy's name, but that plus actually I took drafting class in high school, which was another kind of requirement back then. Now they've completely given away with it, but
as long as you show up, you're good.
I learned like how to project orthographic views into a 3D view, and it was pretty technical stuff, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
So I think that's the sort of engineering side of my family. Like, most people hate perspective, but for me,
it shows. When we did that one interview, it was because we were on, I guess, Zoom or whatever it was, and seeing all your room, your workspace, and see all these 3D models that you did, and obviously that's what you do for creating these worlds, which we'll get into momentarily. But that obviously it came into severe play.
Yeah, I guess there was also another hobby that I had. I sort of forgot about as a kid. In addition to the drawing, I would sculpt and paint miniatures and build dioramas of them. And I got to a certain level. The first place I entered, it was like some kind of like fantasy role playing convention, and I won first, second, and third place. And it was the first thing that I ended. And I was just a little kid. I was probably 11 or something like that. My mom dropped me off, and then one of these guys was really nice to me and kind of showed me around. And then I remember standing in the room, and all these adults were so much taller than me, and they were asking each other, who was this Craig Elliott that won like first, second, and third? I was like, that's me. Those are mine. And they didn't believe me at first. They were like, okay, kid, whatever. And eventually, like, people, and that guy that sort of like walked me around came in and said, no, this is I saw him bring them with his mom. And everyone was like, what? It was really fun. I had never entered anything since then, but that was kind of enough, right?
Yeah.
Like, when you in for a second and third, like, okay, that's, walk out on the high note.
Yeah.
So that's probably some of the 3D stuff that you saw, like little
Yeah.
figurines,
Yeah.
and I still do that. That's sort of applied to my work at Sideshow, and because they do 3D figures, collectibles. I have an interest in that, even though it's funny. It's like it's one of those things that I never found a sustaining um, like more than even a few years long job at, but I just do it on the side, right? Even like on shows that I'm on, I'll just do it for fun, like I sculpt a little figure and then maybe make it to give away to the crew, or um, I don't know if you know who Andreas Deja is, the animator. He animated Scar and Hercules and a bunch of other. He's one of the sort of Disney legend animators. He just did a film called Mushka, which I did background painting for, and then I also sculpted the maquette, and it may be like a 12-inch long tiger with a little girl, and those are the two main characters, and they're on a base of snow. It's about a tiger in Russia and this little girl who sort of adopts it and raises it. And I fully painted the one for him, and then I did maybe 7 or 10 copies just in gray for the main animators, the crew. It was a small crew, so and he paid me to do all that, like just kind of on a lark, right? He said, I need someone to do my cat. I'm like, I can do that.
Do you ever do those things for reference for movies? Create those 3D to
yeah sometimes. I'll either do that and most of what I design are like environments, interiors and exteriors of like cities, towns, forests, things like that. So I have done like sort of like ground planes, like lumpy clay, right, to kind of get the feel of it, or the perspective or lighting, right, of something organic, or even just putting like pieces of cardboard in that clay, right, to cubes here and there to just like represent what an arrangement of houses, or James Gurney does that a lot. He actually takes it a lot further. The illustrator, like Dinotopia, right? Like that's his fame. He has some good how-to books on how he does that. But I think I probably used 3D model a little bit more because it's sort of something that I can also hand to other people. And also as a production designer, sort of art supervisor, right? Like I often don't have time to take everything to finish, but I can sort of sketch something up in the 3D program, right? And put those basics there and then hand it to an artist, say, give me all the details, right? This is kind of where I want stuff.
All right.
And then they can take it to finish. And
what's been an example of doing the 3D modeling, which took a project that was stalled or bugged or that just it wasn't right, that then that's what's wrong with it, and helped resolve it? Because Dan Dos Santos spoke to the winners yesterday, and he talked about how much time he spends with he either takes he takes photos of everything. He said, I'm not so good at remembering how things are supposed to go. I take pictures, and until I get it just right, then I can paint that. And he'll take a gum eraser and carve that up and make something, so he can get, when the light shines on it, how does the angle work, and how do I get that perspective where you're going straight in, which is a really hard perspective to make it look right. What's an example of something where you've used that and that's helped make something from like awesome to like incredibly beautiful, like in one of your movies or one of your projects that's like a famous one?
All of the examples I can think of off the top of my head are things I can't talk about because they're all the recent things. Actually, here's a physical thing. So Iwaju. So Disney recently came out with a Disney Plus animated series called Iwaju, which was a partnership between a Nigerian group of like artists and designers and writers, and then a group at Disney. Great people. They're amazing, funny, and they're all sort of from Lagos, which is the biggest city.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a futuristic take on the sort of social issues and particularities of that city. And it's a very interesting city. But one of the things I had to design was there's sort of like the father character in the show has this very futuristic. He's a scientist, and he has this very futuristic looking sort of A-frame house, and then a big like land around it. And I designed all of the sort of little accoutrements in like on his property, right? So there was like a carport with cars and boats in it, and a tennis course, and a like lounge area with these futuristic chairs. And I mean, it all sounds sort of like boring if you just sort of name off the things, but I tried to add something futuristic or like interesting to each one. Like the tennis court, the net came out of the ground, and then or it was just two poles, right, that came out of the ground, and then the net was like projected and created with a laser, right? So that you just saw these two things come out of the ground, and then you get this really cool net that actually something would bounce off of, right? But one of the things that and you said like, oh, well, how was it something that was a problem, right? And I was asked, there are these kind of pools that line the driveway, and they wanted statuary lining the driveway, but they didn't want them to be realistic. They wanted them to be like to have some connection with African art or the sort of the Nigerian feel of the show, but that would fit with this very like this A-frame house almost was like a spaceship, right? It was very futuristic. And I was doing a lot of sketching, like banging my head against the sketchbook, like trying to get some really cool sort of, I was focusing on like, because a lot of times you see like, if you go to say Hearst Castle, you'll see like these really nice, like kind of Greek goddesses, like the marbles that they have there are gorgeous. So it's kind of, I had that in my head. That's what this guy is like. He's like a Hearst of this world, because he's such a successful and famous scientist. And I was drawing more realistically, and then I was trying this like super simple cubey like approach that was like it looked like abstract modern art too much. And I just sort of got stuck with my drawing. Like I couldn't find that right medium place, the in between the sort of spacey sci-fi and the classical sculpture. And I just said, I'm going to start sculpting this thing. And I just got a bunch of clay, right? And started, or actually, no, I started trying to do it in 3D in the computer. And because what I wanted to try to do is make this character out of triangles, right? And that's what the computer is great at, like simplifying things down to triangles. But there are not really tools that allow you to sculpt at a extremely low resolution like that. Like imagine your forehead is an entire triangle, right? Like no, the technology is geared to making something as realistic as we are, so that it puts thousands of triangles there.
Yeah.
And it just, all it wants to do is this really realistic thing. And so I was like, no, I was sort of fighting that. And then that's why I actually got the clay out and started, I'm going to make these things in real life. And I ended up sculpting one that I really, really liked. And then sort of drew a couple variants off of that. So we didn't have just one sculpture copied. But that was an occasion where it was sort of the only solution to actually do it in physical space, because I just kept being blocked in every other approach. But yeah, and you can see them in the show. They're sort of like African women with a big kind of afro hair, and they have big like jars of water, and they're pouring the water into the pools on either side of the driveway. And they're like, like I said, the forehead is like one triangle, and the cheeks are another triangle. I don't even think they have noses. They're very simplified, but I was really happy with how they turned out. Like,
good, yeah.
Not quite like any modern sculpture I had seen, but
it worked
also
for that project.
Futuristic. Yeah.
Well, that's good then. So on, I still tell this story to the Illustrator winners when I greet them. And I'm still just totally in shock when you told me this. you had followed the Illustrators of the Future from the very get-go. You were aware of it, but you didn't want to enter because you didn't think you were good enough. And so that's, even though I'm still shocked, I found that that's not such an uncommon issue for an artist.
Right.
So I'd like to discuss that too, the quality, I guess you call it, of an artist to think that they don't have the right touch to be able to make it, and yet they're brilliant. So can we just, because that to me is really important, because there's so much creativity out there, and unfortunately we're in an age where creativity gets more and more trounced on, and now with AI it's even more trounced on. And so we need the creatives to stand up and say, we are here.
It's true. Yeah, we do tend to like slink back in the corner and have like a low self-estimation of ourselves. Not necessarily, I think, not that we're like a depressive group, or like, I think when I said that, I didn't feel like, down on myself or anything
No,
necessarily.
I'm not even thinking that. I just think like, you're such a brilliant artist, and then thinking that you weren't good enough to enter a contest. How many other people are like that have that same mindset?
Many, yeah. No, I think it's true. And in teaching and mentoring people, I would sort of think to myself that I'd probably encourage someone else to do something that I wouldn't necessarily myself do. I think that quality is some of it has to do with the nature of art to be, and artists to want to have their own, like, it's an individual thing, right?
Mhm.
Like we judge our largely we judge our work against ourselves, and that's a very insular thing to do, right? Like
Right.
it's sort of self-circular, and so when you spend most of your time like looking at your work, judging yourself based on it, and like, oh, I didn't get that hand right, or those colors don't work, it looks like Neapolitan ice cream and not skin, right? um and that's the kind of thing that we think of like every minute of every day. Sometimes we go out there and look at other people's work, and a lot of the response I think that we give ourselves is like, oh shoot, I wish I could do that, right? And a lot of that is unfortunately, I think, wrong thinking. I think so this comparison thing, right? It comes down to a comparison. Like, we can't really compare ourselves to other people because art is an individual thing, right? Like,
Right.
yet you sort of have to in some realms because there are skills. So it's a very complex set of things. And I think that in the end, because sort of the ideal is that you are individual and have your own voice, how do you compare yourself to an artist, say, who has won a contest? It's very hard. Like, your work is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you set it next to it, and if it's different in any way, you almost think, well, because mine isn't like theirs, I can't win. But I don't want to make mine like theirs because I'm an individual. And you go, oh well, I won't enter, right? Like, I think that's where that comes from for me. Like, for better or worse, it's hard being like, well, I mean, you can just walk up to my work and see it objectively, right? But we're so, like, we're in this ocean of all the years of our own work and all of the work that we've created, and our particular thought patterns, and you can just walk in and be like, oh well, this one's great, and this one's great, and this one's great, and they're all different, and you should all win, right? Like, but yeah, I think we don't think that way. It's really hard to compare ourselves to other people in an objective way. And I think that's probably where a lot of that comes from. And I see it in so many starting and young artists. And it's like, I try to do exactly what you do, is encourage them to just try, right? Like, maybe it only costs $60 or $100 to enter like 4 or 5 pieces in a, whatever contest, or it's free, or especially if it's free, just try. I think there's always some fear of rejection. That's a human thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's also you just try again too. Like,
Yeah.
I think I would probably say to someone, did you give up the first time you tried to draw a hand? No, you've been trying for 15 years, right? Like you keep drawing hands. Like you're not, every character doesn't have their sleeves down, right? Like it's like you haven't given up on the idea of hands. Well, don't give up on the idea of entering, or
Right. It's a similar thing like with the writers too, but just with illustrators. You go to a store, you buy a guitar. Okay, now would you expect that somebody will sit down with a guitar and start playing, Jimi Hendrix, or they really like, their favorite flamenco guitars? No, they spent years getting to that point. So to think anything less than that for your creativity as an artist is only doing yourself a disservice. But one thing about Illustrators of the Future is that it is free to enter, as you mentioned, and it's blind judge. So all the judges are going to see is your art and a number. They don't know your name. So if somebody's got like a real, they're very sensitive about being rejected, or somebody knowing that, okay, well, I don't want them to hear my name and associate it with this less than perfect piece, or any other various forms of denigrating one's art, they won't. They'll have no idea who it is. So even as you continue to expand in your skill set, you can grow on that, and you will get to the point of getting critiques from the judges, and it does make a difference. And with Illustrators of the Future, if you look at the art, the winning art that gets published in each volume, it is such a wide spectrum these days. Since Echo came on, we have Chinese, we've got Vietnamese is totally different. You got Korean, we've got Latam, like Mexico, we've got South Africa, and they're all different styles of art. You don't have to be like a Disney artist in order to win, Illustrators of the Future. It is so all over the spectrum of types of art and use of color and depth, and some of it is, the real popular for teens and stuff like that. We don't necessarily do anime per se, but that type of characterization they'll win. To old school, some people do oil. They submit, they do oil. They work only in that, and some only work on computers with Photoshop, or and there's other renderings, or they do combinations. So it's open to anybody with all types of art styles, that they can create to, which is different than what it used to be, because it's now Echo is very open as that gatekeeper to coming into the contest. She herself being very brilliant. But you're going to be talking to the students a bit later on, so a bit, like, without giving like this is my lecture, but sort of, what do you discuss? What do people like? What do artists really like learning from you, hearing from you? Because I'd like to address that, because this is going to go out obviously to a lot more people than those illustrators that you'll be speaking to a bit later today.
Sure. Well, it is interesting. Going back to what you were talking about like encouraging and inspiring people. One of the things that I like to focus this talk on with the winners is I sort of call it polishing your facets, like something like that, where we tend to sort of select away pieces of brilliance that we have because, again, we're comparing ourselves. So there are a lot of negatives to comparing yourself as an artist. So I think that's part of why we shy away from it, right? And one of the things that happens is people, they've got this, we all have this set of abilities. Like maybe you're a great cook and you're a great writer and you have a really great sense of fashion. Like, I don't know, like all of like a really deep catalog of things about you, but say maybe those things are true. Why would you limit yourself to just cooking, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Like, oh no, I'm not going to use my sense of fashion and I'm just going to, buy whatever, say my wife wants for me, or, it's, why limit yourself, right? So artists do that. And I think that's, again, kind of down to the comparison thing. They see somebody who is, say like Dan Dos Santos, that's in illustrating a book cover, and think, okay, well, he's got that book cover, right? So that means what he's doing are the things that you need to do that. And maybe that's the thing you really want to do. So you might start shaving off and sloughing off or throwing away little pieces of talent that you have that don't sort of fit up with what you see Dan doing, right?
Exactly.
Like, Dan's just doing him, right? Like, and I've known him forever, and like that he all of those methods you talked about and the final look and everything, that's just Dan. And I think that's what people don't realize, is that you can put everything into it. You don't have to limit yourself. And sort of part of what this lecture is that yes, you can, if you get frustrated with drawing in 3D, you can grab some clay, right? And sculpt it and solve the problem that way. Or you can build a guitar if that's your inspiration to do that. And it will fold itself. All of those things will fold themselves and feed back into and amplify what it is that your main thing is, right? And I know it's kind of like an abstract way of
this is
speaking
why I
about it.
never proceeded into art.
We have to start somewhere. Everyone does that drawing, right? And it doesn't mean that you have a limit, right? You know,
this is my second drawing, so
that's awesome. I'm sure mine was the same. I don't think you need to limit yourself.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, so say, and this is something that people comment about me, is like, you do so many things and you do like them really well. Like, I'm a blacksmith, and it's like I do construction. I replace the roof on my house. I do sculpture. I do woodworking. There's landscaping. Like, I've done landscape design for famous people. Maya Bialik, right? I did for her yard. And it's just one of those things that, like, each one of those things, for me, like the landscaping, right? I know plants really well. When I do a painting for, say, like my main job, for a Disney job, or I work for Marvel right now, or as a supervisor, right? And I see the artists like putting plants in their scenes, in their paintings. I know that it doesn't just have to be a lollipop with a green like sucker on top, right? Like, there are like trees with silver leaves, there are trees with large leaves, trees with like glossy green on one side and brown on the other, right? Like, that time spent studying and working with plants and like getting to know the amazing range of colors and flower types and shapes and so forth, I can totally use that, right? And same thing with building construction. When an artist designs, say, a doorway that can't actually be supported, like, imagine you design a doorway made of stone, right? And you put a big stone above the door and then two verticals on either side of that stone. You can do that in drawing, right? But that will induce fear in a person, because subconsciously, because that stone can fall and crush you.
Right.
We actually have this subconscious, I believe, about I think it's like an ancient thing, right? Like, it's been learned into us. Don't go into that cave because, or walk under those trees, because it's precarious. We have a innate sense of something being dangerous. Like,
Right.
It looks like it could slip, or it looks like it could fall. Well, if you draw something that could crush you right when you walk through the doorway, that's going to create an unintentional feeling in a scene. Like, maybe that's supposed to be a love scene and that door is in the background. You don't want this like subconscious, like, oh, kind of why was I nervous when I watched that scene, right? Well, it's because there's a 300-ton stone that could slide down and crush you like a tin can. You need a lintel that goes across those two posts, right? Like Stonehenge, right? Like, that's the sort of the basic construction of all buildings. But if I catch that in an artist's work, I make sure that they make it so that it isn't like subconsciously scary to be around, right? Like, that there is enough support, or even if maybe they do a cantilevered sort of porch or something, and then they have two supports and they're really thin, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a drawing, again, you can do that and it's not going to collapse. It's not a real thing. But if you put those, give them bigger posts, there's a much more sense of calm and and stability, right? Most of the time you want that. You can play that up, of course. Like if you have a scene where you are supposed to be nervous, you are supposed to be agitated, right? You could make things that look like they'll sort of collapse, right? Without making it look like a dilapidated building, but still you'd add a little kind of subtle nervousness to any scene that set would be in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And same with blacksmithing, right? Like I can't say the show, but there's something that I worked on where we did some blacksmithing actually in the show, and I knew what kind of hammers there should be and what kind of anvils and so forth, and it just again added to the realism, of those shots, and that I had directed the artist like, oh yeah, they used this kind of anvil back then, and they would have had this kind of hammer, right? And instead of it being a fantasy, right, or a half truth, right?
Right.
People can actually learn something real from that shot, right?
Right.
So sort of where I try to focus is that, yeah, maybe we have all these things that we think are distractions, right, from the main, I want to be a book cover artist or something like Dan. You can totally use all those things, right? Like, even, working with wood, like you can make stretchers for your canvases, you can make frames for your paintings, right? Like there's all of this stuff can feed right back into everything else. Like everything informs everything else. So don't limit yourself from learning other facets of art, or if it's not, even if it's engineering or it's programming, or do the things that inspire you. And I think that we're all given this set of things that interest us, and we're supposed to follow them because they all come together to make who you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like cutting off your arm because no one else has an arm is a crazy idea, because you could use that arm, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I try to focus on.
Well, that's amazing.
In my lecture.
We talked before. You've been following the writers and illustrators of the future from the get-go. How familiar are you with L. Ron Hubbard as an author / artist?
Quite familiar. I've been encountering his stuff for probably since around college age, maybe a little younger. Just through, like, probably the biggest impetus I had was sort of when Fawcett started doing the covers for the writers and illustrators of the future, because I was always a big fan, and I got to know him actually while he was still alive, and visited and asked him about it, and actually probably before the internet, I hadn't seen some of the lectures that he had spoken.
Right.
Like, it was an interview, I think, with you, right?
Right.
And I just thought, that was probably the best interview that he's ever done, right? I think, even though there was the film that Lance did, you just had the right questions, I think, right? Like, as an artist.
I think a lot of the interviews were recorded audio, but not video.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things too that people are just amazed with actually seeing him there talking, how easy it is talking, about it. But he really respected L. Ron Hubbard for his writing, and L. Ron Hubbard considered him the king of illustration.
Right.
So there
was a perfect match. Yeah.
Perfect match. Yeah. But one thing that L. Ron Hubbard says also is that art is the quality of communication. And that's one of the things that, because you can take sometimes artists, they don't know when to say, okay, it's done. He really got into, okay, so it's that quality of communication you're trying to get across there. And does it communicate what you're trying to do? And that's one thing I saw a lot in your art when I was looking around the stuff in your studios. I look at you sometimes, but mostly I was trying to see, okay, what's that over there? What's that over there?
Yeah, I have an executive at Marvel that whenever I'm in a meeting with her, she always comments on, I want to go there. I want to see what do you have in the background? Yeah, it's all those little projects that little miniature paintings or sketches, or the beginnings of ideas, or like that little sculpture I talked about for Iwaju, just kind of peppered around, and lots of books. Like I have about 3,000 books, I think, in my little 650 square foot house. So it's mostly books, or all of my insulation is books, because the house was made in the 50s and there's no insulation. So the books do the job.
Which is good. Yes. It's probably a lot better air quality, not
Right.
having all the insulation that
That's
decomposes over time, at least for what was used back then.
Yeah.
So, so why should somebody enter Illustrators of the Future?
Wow, good question. I mean, if you want to learn more, if you want to grow more, if you want to, like I was saying earlier, you want to any kind of contest, especially one that, like you say, is free, is going to build your sort of strength, right? Like that willingness to put yourself out there. And okay, so maybe you were rejected the first time or the second time, but then you make it the third, right? But you've actually those if there was a rejection, that makes you stronger.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make you weaker. I know I thought that it made me weaker when I first started. It's having someone say no kind of like fuels a little fire inside of us, I think. If that happens, it's like it's motivation. I think that's what it comes down to, is like, yeah, if one gets, even if it's like a little rejection, like, oh no, hey, okay, yeah, I'll show you next time, right? Like I'm gonna learn these new skills, and I'm gonna study this much to get to that next level where, hey, yeah, I can get in the next time. And but then also, especially the benefits of this project, and I mean, I don't know what to call it, project, because there's so many aspects to it, right? When the illustrators can come and talk to us, like, man, if I had access to someone that had been like me, that had been working in an industry for 30 years, or 29.99999, I didn't have that kind of thing. I mean, maybe a couple people came to Art Center. Like I know Crash McCreary came, and gosh, maybe another. I think maybe Sid Mead showed up too, but we never got to sit in a room with them and talk to them and look at their portfolio and have them look at our portfolio and say, email me whenever you want, right? Like I tell that of any of these artists, right? Like just let me know. Like you do something new and you don't know what to think of it, or you get a job and you want to know how much should I charge, right? Like just ask me anything, right? Like it's only gonna take me a couple seconds, and you can benefit from all that experience that I have. And I think all of the judges are like that, right? Like everyone is really open, and yeah, it's like it isn't just the contest. It's like, hey, we've got another artist friend. It really
becomes a family on this.
Yes, yeah.
Now, one thing, when Writers of the Future began, it was a writing competition, and we hired various other artists to illustrate some of the stories, not all of them. And then a few years into it, we had Frank Kelly Freas came on board. He loved illustrating Owen Hubbard's stories because he said they were so easy to get images out of, to be able to illustrate. And so he brought in some of his, some of those first judges were just amazing. There was Ed Cartier, was one of the first judges, and Vincent DeFate, Leo and Diane Dillon, Will Eisner, Bob Eggleton, H.R. Van Dongen. I'm just running through the list now. Like I said, Kelly Freas, Frank Frazetta, Jack Kirby. We had, I mentioned earlier, Gary Meyer. We had, they're all the first judges that we had, and it's just continued like that.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a definite sense of the symbiotic relationship of illustration, not art, but illustration, to distinguishing fine art from illustration, because illustration helps tell a story with storytelling, as was done in Pulp Fiction days. Can you comment on that, just how it evolved? Because you're very well read, and I don't know how much it's a rarity, but it's not all that common for an artist. When I talk to them, like, have you read this? Have you read? No, I don't. They just do their art. They're into art, and you've got that from having read so much. I think that gives you a lot more bullpen too of things to pull from. Have you thought about that before? Has that come up to you as a point? Because that you say you have so many books, and
Right.
from remember before too, you were familiar with Hubbard as an author as well. Having read some of his books.
Right.
I know, because creativity and imagination, when you read, really gets triggered, and you already live in the world of imagination.
Right.
How much that affects, or how much that would be an advantage to at least read the project that you're going to do, or
Right.
be familiar with that.
That's a really good point. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that, and I think it is something that I know that I have always had, and maybe like you say, like that, maybe that is kind of the root of where my inspiration to be an artist comes from, in a lot of senses, right? Like, so I know when I'm reading a book, and I didn't think that, I basically thought that everyone was like this, right? Like, and I think it's probably not the case, but it's almost like when somebody is writing, right? Like, whether it's Hubbard or Tolkien or whoever it might be, the and I think there are certain authors, and Hubbard is certainly one of them, that do that, like, this happens more to, and I think also Tolkien. There's just a reason I mentioned them, but and this happens with every book or passage or script that I read. As I read it, it's like watching a little movie.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's almost like, as I read the words, and more so with some writers, there is this, it's hard to put in words. It's like you're walking along a street, or through a forest, or the hallway of a spaceship, whatever it might be, and there's just white paper in front of the character, and as right where that character is walking, it becomes a drawing, and then it becomes color, right? Like, as they walk through, and behind them is this full color, fully imagined real world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens in my mind as I'm reading. Like, usually you're following a character doing something, or thinking, or moving through a space, right? Running or fighting or flying or whatever. And it's this, it becomes visual, right?
Right.
As they push through, every word pushes you through, like, creates more color and more drawing and more life, right? I hope that makes any sense.
No, it does, because it's one of the things I know that Hubbard talked about in some of his other researches and stuff. He thought everybody imagined in full color, and all the in motion and stuff like that. And then when he came to realize, like, I don't get pictures, or it's just black and white, or there's, and he didn't realize it because he thought that everybody did that. When he found out they didn't, it was like, wow. And some people listening to this are like, what? You can think in color? Or some people can only think black and white. It's that whole range, and so that you can, that's how you do it. Some people go like, how does he do that? They'll be amazed, or others might say like, wow, I've never met somebody like that. There's just, it's one of those like jaw-dropping moments where you're like, or an epiphany that, wow, there's different kinds of people.
Yes, this is very true, and I've definitely learned that since too. That, for me, a lot of doing art is trying to get that thing that I imagine, like how cool it is in my head, and even the glory and the frustration of it. The frustration in that, like, I'm not achieving the thing that's in my head. That, and it's not just an image; it's also a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
just like it is, say, when you on vacation and you see an incredible sunset, it's not just, oh, that's a nice yellow, and you feel something, right?
Yeah.
And so I see in my head, I see a thing and I feel a certain way about it, and I try to get that on a flat surface, or whether it's sculpted or whatever. And the glory is when I get close to it. I never achieve it, of course, and so that in a way, that's always the thread, that's the carrot that's making me run after art, right? Is trying to get both the feeling and the image wise, but and it's amazing when I get sort of close.
But that's
But
one of the
also
qualities that
frustrating.
masters have, though, too, is the ability to.
Yeah, I guess. But it's interesting because in the sort of scientific research that I've read, and the artists that I've met, there are actually Disney animators, like really well-known Disney animators, Glenn Keane as one of them, who cannot see an image in their head. They see nothing. But they are still brilliant. He animated Tarzan and Rapunzel and dozens of other amazing characters. It just happens on the paper, and for me, that's like, how? But they do it, right? So it's so I think, yes, like you say, people are different, but that doesn't mean that you can't be an artist,
Right.
if you don't see it in, say, the way I'm describing that I see it. Because Glenn is like, yeah, he's incredible, and there's so many other artists that are the same way.
Yeah,
They
we
just
had
don't see that.
We had a grand prize winner, 10 years ago, who couldn't see color, and so he memorized the Pantone
Mm.
color, and then he would know that the Pantone, this number was that color, and so he would put stuff together by that method, and he was brilliant. He
Right.
won grand prize that
Oh, yeah.
year.
Yeah,
And we have somebody, I think, this year who is colorblind, but yet they're able to like create amazing art. So yeah, you're not pegged. If you can't do something, then it's like dealing with what your resources are, and working with that to be able to maybe outcreate some of the other things that are a disability, because not everybody's got 100% across the board on ability.
Right.
So the accent is on the abilities that you do have, and those can then circumnavigate some of the, inabilities or lesser abilities.
Yeah.
It was an interesting story with Larry Elmore. He was, because I love his art. He's just amazing.
He's one of my favorite early artists.
Yeah.
I collected D&D or Dragon magazine and sort of the D&D calendars, and I've known of him forever.
And he told a story about, somebody says, oh yeah, that's an Elmore rock. He said, what? Yeah, your rocks all look the same. I said, what? And then he started looking, he started studying. He's like, they are, and rocks are different. He spent hours and hours and hours learning how to paint a rock. It's just a little side thing in his art, but like, you just do a rock. It's like what you're saying with what you're doing on creating these different things here. Sometimes you have to really get into it. And so he said, I studied, and then he did the same thing with waterfalls, because his waterfalls were all the same. It's just a waterfall.
Yeah.
And then he started looking at it. He went to waterfalls and look, how's that working? How's it going? Like, how do you get that look in the water? And what about this? What about that? And just hours and hours and hours to be able to just get a waterfall, and hours and hours and hours just to get a rock. Like you're saying, 40 hours or however long to be able to do a hand. Not 40 hours, like 4 years to be able to keep on getting it right. And that's something that an artist needs to really get. So we're down to our last couple of minutes here. So just a little bit about that, like the patience required to really hone a skill, and how to, what should a person anticipate?
It's actually very interesting that you bring up the idea of that's an Elmore rock, because I totally agree with that. I think that we can't not do our version of something, and that's a good thing. It's like you have a style. People worry about what's my style? Just learn to draw a rock and it will come out, right?
Right.
And like you said with Larry, yeah, you go and you study something, and the patience required, I think, is I think for a lot of artists, we don't really even necessarily think about that. We just think about like doing it until we get that rock to look like a rock to us, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's how Larry thought, because that's how else do you do it, right?
Yeah.
It's going to look like a rock to Larry, and it won't look like a rock to Frazetta, right? Like, I remember driving to his house, looking at the formations in Pennsylvania and going, now I know what he's been studying, because the rocks in his paintings look like, and I remember telling him that, and he looked at me funny and kind of like shook it off. And then later he said, you're right. The color and the shapes are the local rocks here in Pennsylvania. And he had never even because that was just what he'd go to a baseball game or he'd go hiking or something, and that's the rocks he would see. And they just sort of like got into his body, right?
Yeah.
And that's what was around to study too, right? Especially when, he didn't have the internet. There was no such thing, right? So he's looking at the stuff that's around him and just kept doing it until it felt like a rock to him, because those are the kinds of rocks he grew up around, right?
Totally different than Southwest.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, right. If you grew up in Taos or something, what felt like a rock to you, what felt like a correct rock, is going to be different than so yeah, I think that, again, like you say, patience certainly is a virtue in art. I think most artists just tend to be patient and sort of introverted in a way. Some, I think, but certainly there's a range of personalities, and frustration is part of art, right? If you have a little bit less patience than some other artists, there may be a frustration there in achieving some of these things, but they are things that can be achieved, right? Like, and then that frustration falls away, right? Because you can now paint hands or rocks or whatever and focus more on making that full picture of all of things in your head, right? So I think for everyone, there is going to be a certain amount of frustration, whatever like amount of patience you were sort of gifted with. Just keep going, right? Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Well, this has been a great interview. I really appreciate this. So how do people find you? Just be able to see your art?
Boy, you can find me at CraigElliottGallery.com is my main website. I have portfolios on Cara. I have a portfolio on ArtStation. You can find my work on social media, Instagram, Twitter. I'm on Facebook probably more than any of the others, because I find it more conversational, and less fighty.
Yeah.
But yeah, or just Google my name. There's even a Wikipedia page on me somewhere, I think.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. Writers of the Future series can be purchased wherever books are sold in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and South Africa, and available everywhere via Amazon.com. We're especially appreciative of our sponsor, Carnation, for supporting this podcast. Carnation was introduced in 1899, and 2024 marks its 125th birthday. So Carnation has been making delicious milk products for 1.25 centuries and is still going strong. Now, if that doesn't show consumer support, I don't know what does. Writers and Illustrators of the Future contest created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged for 4 decades. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy. Again, thank you very much, Craig.
You're welcome.
Welcome to the Outer Realm with Michelle DeRoche and